My name is Yvonne Ortiz, NRCDV's Training and Education Specialist. For Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, we are highlighting the work of Rights for Girls, a human rights organization focused on gender-based violence against young women and girls in the U.S. Through this webinar, we will explore how the intersections of race, gender, and violence cause our most marginalized girls to be criminalized for their experiences of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. Before I welcome our presenters today, Cherice, Hopkins, and Rebecca Burney, I want you to invite, and let me see if I can pass our slide. Justine, if you could pass the next slide. Thank you. We wanted to invite you to check out our Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month events and activities. For this month, as I mentioned, we're highlighting the power of young activists and the unique contributions of young people in community organizing for social justice. Our very own NRCDV radio podcast, Stories of Transformation, for the entire month of February is featuring the stories of young activists, advocates, organizing, and social change makers aged 12 to 20. They're telling their story of why they're activists. Follow us at National TV BAM and join the conversation on Twitter at #TeenDVMonth, #IamAnActivist. Also, I will encourage you to read our awareness blog, Healthy Me, Healthy We, where we highlight the work of Break the Cycle on Knowing Your Self-Care slogan. We also develop a technical assistance question of the month on youth activism, and you can find it on Bonnet. And if you want to learn more about each of one of these activities, events, and resources, there's the information. Look at us at nrcdv.org/training. And now I want to welcome our two amazing presenters. We have Cherice Hopkins, and she is a staff attorney at Rights for Girls, a human rights organization committed to ending gender-based violence in the U.S., where her work includes research, education, and advocacy. Her focus is identifying and addressing the root causes of problems which hinder gender and racial equity. Her prior experience includes the provision of consultation services to nonprofits and small businesses founded by women and people of color in the areas of analysis, research, and strategic planning. Cherice received her JD from Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and is a member of the Minnesota State Bar. Welcome, Cherice, and now we welcome Rebecca Burney. She's an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Rights for Girls, where she focuses on the intersection of female sexual abuse and juvenile justice system involvement in Washington, D.C. She has extensive experience working with survivors of sexual abuse. Rebecca served as a sexual assault counselor and first responder for the Listening Ear Crisis Intervention Center in Lansing, Michigan, where she worked with nurses, prosecutors, and police officers to coordinate care and advocacy for sexual abuse survivors. She has also worked directly with youth involved in D.C. foster care system as a court-appointed special advocate, CASA, and has mentored delinquent young during incarceration in local communities. Rebecca holds a BA in political science and ethnic students from Brown University and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where she has a public interest fellow. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. We really appreciate that introduction, and thank you to the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence for inviting us to conduct the webinar. And thank you to everyone who's on the call. We appreciate your joining us. We know that you have lots of options for how you choose to spend your time, so we're thankful that you want to learn more about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. It's something that we feel is very important, and we at Rights for Girls, we're very passionate about raising awareness of the pipeline and working to dismantle it. As Yvonne mentioned, I'm Cherice Hopkins, and I'm joined by Rebecca Burney today, and we're both with Rights for Girls. And as she said, we're a national human rights organization that's based in D.C., working to combat gender-based violence against young women and girls, specifically in the United States. And as part of our work, we really advocate for the inclusion of girls' voices and experience in order to address gender-based violence, particularly girls who are othered and marginalized, like girls of color, and as a result of that marginalization, their experiences and their voices are often overlooked and ignored, as we can see happens with the case of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. But the way I can best describe our work is engaging in policy reform and research, training technical assistance, advocacy campaigns that are really at the intersections of racial justice, violence against young women and girls, and systems reform, particularly improving system responses to survivors of violence. And as a result of this work, we find ourselves operating in different spaces, including juvenile justice spaces. And a few years ago, when we'd go into juvenile justice spaces, trying to raise conversations about girls, we were met with resistance, and the conversations really tended to focus on boys. And when we would try to push back and say, what about girls, people wouldn't want to talk about girls because they weren't involved in the justice system at the same rates as boys. And so we decided to expand our conversations that we were having with girls who were involved in the justice system to find out directly from them what were they experiencing. And what we learned is that a lot of them experienced sexual abuse prior to entering the system. And so we looked at the data that was available, and we learned that this was overwhelmingly the experience of girls. And in fact, sexual abuse is a primary predictor of girls' entry into the juvenile justice system. And as a result of that, we wrote a report called The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, The Girl Story, that we co-authored with the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality and the Myth Foundation in 2015. And so you'll hear us use the term sexual abuse to prison pipeline, which describes the ways of the gendered violence that leads girls into the juvenile justice system. And we'll also sometimes say abuse to prison pipeline instead of sexual abuse to prison pipeline, where we're talking about other forms of violence, such as family violence and physical abuse, that also render girls susceptible to justice involvement. And so what we really want to do today is, as Yvonne shared, talk about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, but specifically how our girls are experiencing violence, and particularly when it's girls of color and our most marginalized girls, our response to the violence that they experience is not to meet them with services, but to actually criminalize them for their responses. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, who's going to talk a little bit more and get us started with discussing about what type of violence are our girls experiencing.
Great, and thank you so much, Cherice, and thank you for having me. So when we think about girls in the United States, one of the things that the Me Too movement has really highlighted is that girls across the country, regardless of their class or race or gender identity, are experiencing sexual violence at astronomical levels. And this violence is something that they're experiencing at home, in the community, as well as in schools. And as we know, these experiences range from street harassment and harassment by peers to sexual assault. In addition, many girls are witnessing or experiencing domestic violence. So when we talk about dating violence, it's really important to think about the types of relationships that young women and girls are seeing modeled before them. So we know from research that girls that grow up in an abusive household and witness an abusive relationship are actually more likely to be in an abusive relationship in their own lives. And they're also more likely to experience teen dating violence. So teen dating violence, as I mentioned, is another form of violence that girls experience. And we're really interested at Rights for Girls in looking at the link between gendered violence and dating violence and how dating violence is leading girls into the juvenile justice system. And Cherice will speak a little bit later about domestic child sex trafficking, but we definitely wanted to highlight here that this is another form of gender-based violence that's often leading girls into the juvenile justice system as well. Okay. So teen dating violence, and we're really excited to be able to speak this month about this important issue. And we really can't ignore the links between teen dating violence and trauma and justice system involvement for girls. The percentage of girls who have experienced physical or sexual dating violence is striking. So nearly 21% have experienced dating violence, and 1 in 5 tweens knows a survivor of dating violence. And of course, these are just numbers of people who have reported experiencing dating violence. And as we know with sexual assault and sexual abuse, these numbers tend to be underreported. So, it's very likely that these statistics are not quite as accurate as we would like them to be. So one of the things that we want to focus on is this link between domestic violence and intimate partner violence later in life. We do know that girls who are in abusive relationships as teens, or between the ages of 11 and 17, are also more likely to experience violent relationships in adulthood. So as I mentioned previously, if you witness domestic abuse in your household, if you witness your parents in an abusive relationship, you're more likely to have an abusive relationship in your teenage years, but you're also more likely to be a victim of domestic violence in adulthood. So hopefully by addressing teen dating violence, we can prevent future cases of domestic violence that often leave women victimized in our country. Okay, and this slide also just gives some statistics that we do know, and like I said, these are just reported instances of domestic violence. So we know that 22% of women who experience domestic violence as adults had their first experience with intimate partner violence between 11 and 17. So this research is really just sort of highlighting what I mentioned previously about these links. And so we're hoping that by disrupting the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, by focusing on gendered violence at early ages and during development, we can hopefully prevent future violence towards women and girls. So as I mentioned, gender-based violence is experienced by girls of all races and classes, but as Cherice previously discussed, we know that the most marginalized young women and girls are often ending up in the juvenile justice system for the same experiences of trauma. So why is this? Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that when a girl has a stable family and economic stability, she can receive access to services and supports necessary to heal from her trauma. However, girls without access to these resources are criminalized. And when you think about services and supports that are necessary to heal, I mean, these can include anything from therapeutic interventions to moving to a safer environment where you do not have to be around your abuser. There's a whole host of research around ways to cope with trauma. And one of the things that we're finding is that girls who don't have these resources and supports must often come up with their own coping mechanisms. These coping mechanisms can include anything from substance abuse. Some girls will attempt to run away from their abusers and often find themselves in the criminal justice system for running away, for status offenses. Girls who try to self-medicate through drugs and alcohol often are arrested for possession and use of drugs and illegal substances. Girls who are experiencing violence in schools, they may choose not to attend school because they feel it's unsafe for them. Unfortunately, they're also arrested for truancy. And so as we have these conversations around gendered violence, it's important to think about class and access to resources. And if a girl who has, a stable family environment, if a girl who has economic stability, if she would not be criminalized for her trauma, why are we criminalizing the most marginalized girls? So what do we know about girls in the juvenile justice system? So the rate of girls entering the juvenile justice system is increasing at every point of contact. So the numbers of arrests have increased by 40%, detentions have increased by 40%, probations have increased, as well as post-adjudication placements. But we do know that girls are not becoming more violent. So most of the arrests of girls are for nonviolent offenses. And when you think of these offenses, they're often offenses that we call status offenses because the youth is a minor. So something like running away is an act that could lead a girl into the juvenile justice system. But of course, running away is not a crime for an adult. And what we're also seeing is that the criminalization of these responses to trauma is also having a disproportionate impact on girls of color. So even though it's widely known and recognized with the Me Too campaign that girls of all races and girls of all classes experience gendered violence and experience abuse, when we look at our juvenile justice system, girls of color are overrepresented. So even though girls of color only account for about 22% of the population, they comprise nearly 66% of girls who are incarcerated. And when you look specifically at Black girls and at Native American girls, they're impacted at even more disproportionate rates. And Black and Native American girls are actually 20% more likely than white girls to be formally petitioned. So, when we think about how we as a community and when we think about how we as a society respond to trauma and why are we criminalizing some girls over others, it's important to keep these statistics in mind and ask ourselves, are we treating girls of color fairly? So as I mentioned previously, girls are not becoming more violent, and so we really, as an organization, tried to understand what is causing this increase. And our report really highlights the fact that sexual abuse is one of the key predictors of whether or not girls will enter the juvenile justice system. It's nearly impossible to ignore the relationship between trauma and justice system involvement for girls. They're experiencing trauma at disproportionate rates. And as an organization, this is something that we've definitely worked to try to address and understand and come up with policy recommendations to interrupt what we've deemed the abuse to prison pipeline. So one of the reasons why we're seeing these high rates of trauma among girls in the juvenile justice system is because they're being criminalized for their responses to trauma. So we know several things about girls in the system. One of the things that we do know is that there are extremely high rates of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder among girls in the juvenile justice system. They're also disproportionately victims of sexual violence, and they have negative health outcomes. They've also experienced more adverse childhood experiences, and I'll mention in a minute a recent study done by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris about adverse childhood experiences and the impact on health for children. So what are girls entering the system with? So this is a study that was done in 2009, and researchers conducted a health screening of girls entering detention centers in Philadelphia, San Diego, and Santa Cruz. And the numbers are really striking. At entry, 18% had a current suicidal ideation, and 7% had attempted suicide within the last month. So when we talk about depression among young girls that are becoming juvenile justice system involved, I think these numbers are really crucial and really critical. It means that they're entering the system already feeling suicidal. So once they're in the system, as many of you can imagine, unfortunately, our justice system can perpetuate the trauma they've already experienced. It's not as if they're entering some type of youth, sanctuary space. So it's not a place of healing. It's often a place of punishment. And I think it's really important to highlight that they're entering with, severe mental health crisis. Another area that we found particularly striking was that 22% of girls had been sexually assaulted within 7 days prior to entering the detention center. So if you know anyone who's experienced a traumatic event such as sexual assault, you know that the first 7 days are crucial. Most people are in a daze. They're not acting, at the most optimal level. They're probably not making the best decisions. And so girls, when they're entering detention, are in the midst of that trauma. They're in the midst of coping with the event that they've just experienced, and rather than getting the support or resources that they need to heal, they're put into detention centers. So when we think about trauma, it's really not enough to just focus on what girls are entering the detention centers with. There's a whole life trajectory of experiences that they've had that are often troubling. And so it's really important for us to start at the beginning and think about what these girls have been exposed to and experienced over their lifetime. So in the 1990s, researchers began to wonder if there was a link between adversity experienced during childhood and health outcomes for adults. So from 1995 to 1997, over 17,000 patients at Kaiser were evaluated in what became known as the ACE study. And the ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. They identified 10 of them, including emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and they assigned a score based on the number of these ACEs that somebody had experienced. So, for example, if you had one parent that was incarcerated, but you had none of the other adverse childhood experiences, then your score would be 1. And they found that the more ACEs someone had, the more likely they were to have disparate health outcomes, and the more at risk they were for cancer, heart disease, and other illnesses in adulthood. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is a pediatrician in San Francisco, and she recently published a book where she highlights her research, but she's actually found that children with high ACE scores also are experiencing disparate health outcomes in childhood. So exposure to toxic stress and, constant trauma, such as living in a household where there's domestic violence, these experiences are actually altering the DNA of these youth. And she's found that as a result, young girls and boys are having high levels of asthma, they're having behavioral issues, learning disabilities, diabetes, they're at risk for a number of negative health outcomes. And so when we think about girls in the juvenile justice system, it's really important to keep this research in mind when we question why they're behaving the way that they do. So girls in the juvenile justice system have extremely high ACE scores. They're nearly 2 times as likely as boys to report having 5 or more ACEs. And the rates of sexual abuse are over 4 times higher for girls. And so what does this mean? This means, based on all of the research that we know, that they're more at risk for negative health outcomes as adults, but they're also having, behavioral issues, learning disabilities, things that are getting them expelled or getting them arrested, less cognitive development just because of the trauma that they've faced. So it's really important that we keep this in mind when we're considering intervention.
We have a question, I'm sorry to interrupt you, from Loida, and she's asking, I was wondering or pointing out that because of the trauma, many times they can't cope and behave violently or aggressively, and the families do not know what to do so they call the cops and then they are arrested.
Yes, thank you for that question. I was actually just about to cover that in the next slide. So, one of the things that we are seeing is that girls are getting arrested for family violence. So, unfortunately, in some jurisdictions, if the police are called, then the youth is automatically arrested. And so, thank you so much for this question, because often that is what we're seeing. So youth that don't have access to resources to process the trauma they've experienced will act out in anger. They will, use a variety of coping mechanisms that maybe as adults we might say these are not healthy coping mechanisms, but for the youth, it's kind of all they have for survival. So, we're seeing situations where they witness domestic violence in the household. They may feel that they need to fight to protect a loved one who's being violated, and that can cause them to end up in the juvenile justice system. And I think, when you think about the research that Dr. Harris has done, there's a lot of the parts of the brain that would process, the proper responses that one should have, the healthy responses that one should have, those just aren't developed. In many ways, those are stunted because of the trauma that they've experienced. So we're finding that youth who experience a lot of trauma often make decisions that are not in their best interest due to the trauma they've experienced and how it's restructured their brain and restructured their ability to think about long-term consequences. So no, that's definitely an issue that we're seeing, and it's something that, there's no easy answer or easy solution. Parents, often don't want their children to be incarcerated or taken by police, but they may feel that they're, a threat to other members of the household. So I think really for us, the goal is education and making sure that police officers, if they are called, understand how trauma works in adolescence and why they're behaving the way they do, and that the youth are given the supports they need rather than simply, being locked up. Other pathways into the system after abuse, I just wanted to highlight a few. Status offenses, as I previously mentioned. Many girls who are abused will run away if the abuse is taking place in their household. They'll often skip school if they're feeling like school is not a safe environment for them. They will engage in alcohol or tobacco use in order to cope with the trauma. They don't have access to other resources or healthy coping mechanisms, and they will, sometimes violate curfew as well, especially when they don't feel that the household they're in is safe. And unfortunately for girls, all of these behaviors and all of these coping strategies are criminalized. They're called status offenses, and they can get arrested and enter the juvenile justice system for things like running away. And, our argument at Rights for Girls as an organization is really that these youth need support, they need treatment, they need to have their trauma addressed. They don't need to be punished for something that they, are not responsible for. We shouldn't punish victims of crimes. We shouldn't punish victims of trauma. Another pathway we're seeing as well is what we call dual system or crossover. So we're seeing girls who are involved in the child welfare or dependency system actually crossing over into the delinquency system. And again, the reason for this is really abuse and trauma. So if your needs are not met and you're not given the resources to cope with trauma you may have experienced causing you to be in the child welfare system, that trauma doesn't just go away. And as you get older, if you act out on these traumatic events, if you begin to run away or engage in substance abuse, you can find yourself in the delinquency system as well as the child welfare system. And then Cherice will talk a little bit more about this, but domestic child sex trafficking is another pathway into the juvenile justice system for girls. So federal law defines anyone under the age of 18 engaged in commercial sex as a victim of child sex trafficking. And even in jurisdictions that don't arrest girls under the age of 18 for prostitution, they're often arrested for prostitution-related offenses. So unfortunately, we're seeing individuals who are forced into the sex trade being punished. And that's something that Rights for Girls has been working really hard on. We have a campaign called the No Such Thing campaign, and I'll let Cherice talk more about that. So I'm going to end here and turn it back over to Cherice, and she'll speak a little bit more about specific examples of how we're seeing the pipeline in action.
Thank you, Rebecca. So we first wanted to talk about Bresha Meadows, and some of you may be familiar with Bresha's story. Bresha Meadows is a teenage girl, and she grew up in Ohio in an abusive household. Her father physically injured her mother. He threatened to kill Bresha and her entire family, and just she had to cope with a lot of violence, witnessing violence, the trauma from that violence. And as a result, she tried to get away. She actually ran away from home twice, and she was someone who was known to law enforcement and known to systems. She did disclose about the violence in her home, but still was not met with services and was actually taken back to her home. And so as a result of the abuse that she experienced, she shot her father, but again was not perceived to be a survivor of violence or a survivor of trauma, and was instead charged with aggravated murder. She spent a year in a detention center, and as a result of her lawyers and a lot of grassroots organizing and advocacy, really just put a lot of pressure on the systems and was able to make a plea deal where the charges were reduced to involuntary manslaughter. But again, she still has that charge, that conviction of involuntary manslaughter, as well as she's moved to a residential treatment center. So while it wasn't the detention center she was in, it wasn't community-based services, she was still essentially locked up, and she remained there for 6 months, and now she's home. So that is one of the, I know there's a question about family violence and how that can push girls into the justice system, and so we think the story of Bresha Meadows is a prime example of that. So we also want to talk about Cyntoia Brown, and some of you may have heard of Cyntoia Brown recently because her case and her story really got a lot of national attention late last year. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Cyntoia, I just want to give you a little bit of background about her. So she also grew up in an abusive home environment, and she left home in order to escape. And as a result of that, she wound up meeting an older man who she groomed her, as often in the case of trafficking cases, showed her affection, was nice to her, and got her to perceive him as her boyfriend. But then the relationship, well, not the relationship, but her perceived relationship turned violent. He started sexually abusing her. He raped her. He physically abused her. He forced her to take drugs. And he also trafficked her. He forced her to engage in commercial sex with strangers. And one of those strangers was a 43-year-old man who essentially paid to rape Cyntoia. This man was a collector of guns, and Cyntoia was obviously felt threatened in that situation. And so she wound up shooting him in self-defense, but the prosecution still chose to charge her. And so she's not only charged with murder, but she was charged as an adult. This was in 2004. She was convicted of first-degree murder, and she is currently serving a life sentence and will not be eligible for parole until she's 69 years old. And just to give you some context about the time frame that we're in, the seminal piece of legislation that upholds the rights for survivors of trafficking is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That wasn't enacted until 2000. So that's 4 years before Cyntoia's case and before she was charged as an adult. But even then, that act that was currently in place did not contemplate the fact that there could be domestic victims of trafficking. It only contemplated of foreign victims, of people who were forced from their countries or tricked from their home countries to come to the U.S. So it wasn't until after Cyntoia was already charged years later that our federal laws even contemplated and started to address and establish rights for survivors of domestic trafficking. So I think that's just important context to understand the fact that, unfortunately, Cyntoia is not alone. There are other kids who have been trafficked, who are not seen as victims, who the perpetrators of violence against them are not seen as perpetrators of violence, but are seen as Johns. Excuse me. And so I think Cyntoia's story is very sad, very, very disturbing, but unfortunately also representative of what other survivors of trafficking have gone through and how they have been not viewed as survivors of crime and of gender violence, but instead have been criminalized. So we want to talk a little bit more. We've been talking about trafficking. I know Rebecca shared that that's one of the pathways that girls are pushed into juvenile justice, or in Cyntoia's case, adult criminal justice systems. And we know that it's something that people are thankfully more aware of and talking about more, but it's also something where there tends to be some confusion as to what is sex trafficking, and specifically when we're talking about kids, what is domestic child sex trafficking? And so we just wanted to provide a little bit of clarity around that. So domestic child sex trafficking occurs when any person under the age of 18 exchanges sex for anything of value. That's what domestic child sex trafficking is. And I wanted to just clarify, because often I think we hear people talking about in trafficking, and we say traffickers, people think of those who are referred to as pimps. But there are various roles that people play in trafficking. So, for example, there are people who actually get paid to recruit girls and to groom girls and vulnerable kids, and trafficking them that way. So, for example, people like Facebook is a big tool in social media. So there are people who will go on social media and direct message kids and try to lure them away from home, or people who will go to group homes or children and seek out children who are in the child welfare system. Another way people engage in trafficking or have a role in a larger trafficking system is harboring. So they're providing a location where these children are being kept. A big one that I want to point out that not everyone is aware of is that patronizing, or the people who are sometimes called buyers. They engage in trafficking. So the people who pay to have sex with a child, that is trafficking. And so that means that there doesn't always need to be a third party. There doesn't have to be a pimp in order for trafficking to occur. It could just be a buyer and the child. Another thing that I want to point out is that anything of value is not just money. It could be trading sex for basic needs. So for food, for shelter, for a coat. So sometimes you will hear people talk about survival sex, and whenever they're talking about a youth who has exchanged sex for food or sex for a place to stay, that is trafficking. Trafficking has taken place. Another thing that I want to point out is sometimes you may hear people talking about forced partner coercion, and when we're talking about kids, that is not necessary for any forced partner coercion to have occurred. Under federal law, children or minors are legally incapable of consenting to sex. So if, again, like, there doesn't have to be forced partner coercion, if something of value is exchanged in order for someone to have sex with someone under the age of 18, then that is trafficking. The other thing that I want to talk about is just some of the terms. We've already discussed survival sex, but you may also hear people refer to domestic minor sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation of children. Some things that other terms are like child prostitution or juvenile prostitution, sex work, which we find those terms to be very problematic because, again, they imply consent or choice, and we're talking about children here who, legally, they're incapable of consenting. So who are the victims? Who do the traffickers and buyers target? Well, in the U.S., it's primarily U.S. citizens. There was a study conducted of all the national sex trafficking cases, and 83% of confirmed victims were U.S. citizens. Also, a lot are children. A lot are minors under the age of 18. In that same study, over half of confirmed victims were minors. And also, you'll see from some of the other bullet points that we have here is that traffickers really go after those who are vulnerable populations. So not just minors, but even amongst minors. Minors who have learning and developmental disabilities are often targeted. Runaway and homeless youth, again, because they are often lacking stability, lacking support. They have basic needs like clothing and shelter, so they tend to be very susceptible. And because so many homeless youth identify as LGBT or gender nonconforming, then they are at increased risk of being trafficked. And then also a lot of identified trafficking survivors come from the child welfare system, again, because of lacking, those kids often are lacking certain stability. They're looking for relationships, looking for family. And so traffickers are very attuned at pinpointing children's vulnerabilities and trying to frame themselves in a way as they can meet whatever those children's needs are. Another thing that I want to point out is in regards to who tends to be targeted, are a lot of trafficking survivors are female, and a lot are Black children. So 2016 national arrest data shows us that 76% of all juvenile prostitution arrests in the United States are girls, and 57% are Black children, which is more than any other racial group, and this figure has actually gone up. So it was a few years ago 52%, and now it's 57%. And I just want to clarify that this, even though Black children and Black girls, meaning also girls of color, are disproportionately arrested on prostitution charges, we know that this isn't solely an issue of disproportionate contact between police and children of color. And we know that because when we look at jurisdictions like King County, Washington, where they stopped arresting minors on prostitution charges, but they're still proactively taking efforts to identify children who are sex trafficked, that there's still children of color, particularly Black children, are still disproportionately impacted. So again, King County, Washington, we see 52% of identified sex trafficking victims are Black, but Black people are only 7% of the general population. And so that's not even the number of Black children, but Black adults and Black children. And we see the same thing in Portland, Oregon. So even, or not the same numbers, but similar numbers in Portland, Oregon. And so even in places where Black people are small percentages of the population, they still tend to be large percentages of those who are being trafficked for sex. And so I think it's also important to not just look at our responses to the children, but again, what are responses to the perpetrators? What are responses to the people who are buying these children? And so, as you can see, unfortunately, a lot more needs to be done in order to collect this data. But in the jurisdictions where they are collecting the data, we see that often the buyers are white men. Often they are affluent and have money. And in other words, they're in our communities. Many are married. Many have day jobs. King County has done quite a bit of research on this topic, and they found that in their area, many buyers purchase sex between the hours of 2 to 4 p.m., which meant that not only do they have jobs, but they were at work whenever they were making these arrangements to buy children. And often, I'm not sure if you guys have seen, but more and more we see articles in the newspapers detailing stings and arrests of people who are purchasing children for sex. And oftentimes, if you look at those articles, you'll see that the people being arrested are teachers, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're judges, they're police officers. And it's quite the juxtaposition when we look at not just who is being trafficked as opposed to who are the sex buyers, but also our responses. Because again, we see, going back to this slide, so many girls are being arrested on prostitution charges. So many Black children are being arrested on prostitution charges. But then when we look at different jurisdictions, oftentimes buyers are not being arrested. They aren't being fined. There's no accountability. We've actually heard from survivors who have said that when the police came to their hotel room or wherever they were, they told the buyers to leave, and then the survivor was arrested. And again, more data needs to be collected, but in Pennsylvania, I think the numbers are something like 80% of arrests are for regarding sex trafficking or in the sex trade are for those who are selling sex, whereas those who buy it, it's about 18%. So we definitely see where the focus is. And so I think it's important to recognize that, because what does that mean for these girls and their trauma? Well, one, it's reinforcing messages that their traffickers are telling them, that buyers are telling them, excuse me, that other perpetrators of violence are telling them, right? So whether it's a teen dating violence situation, it's their boyfriend, whether it's another form of child sexual abuse, we know that often child predators will tell girls that it's their fault. People won't believe them. In the case of trafficking, traffickers will tell them that you will go to jail. And so when survivors are not met with trauma-informed response, it's reinforcing. And it's also, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, causing them to have to figure out, they're still having these feelings, they're still having this trauma, and so it's causing them to have to figure out how to cope with that trauma on their own, and it's just fueling the cycle of criminalization and victimization. And so it's important to, I think, also talk about not just the trauma that girls have encountered prior to entering the justice system, but what happens to them once they're involved in the justice system, what happens when they're in detention. And so part of it is, as we talked about earlier, that because historically so many males have been involved in the juvenile justice system, the system's really not designed for them. It doesn't necessarily take into account their different physical needs or their different emotional needs and their differences in how they respond to programs. Conditions of confinement, are problematic because they can exacerbate girls' trauma. So think about in some places, strip searches are still conducted, which can be invasive even if you're in a healthy place, let alone if you have experienced something traumatic. Things like shackles, if you've been in places or been experiences where you've been sexually violated and people have held you down or grabbed your wrist, then shackling can be very jarring, as well as girls have also said that they found it to be humiliating. Detention can be loud, so loud noises may be triggering. And sometimes it's things that we don't necessarily think about. So these systems are designed for order and control. And so the kids are being told when to eat, when to sleep. And so that loss of autonomy and, once again, having someone else exercising control over them and how they go about their day can also be triggering to survivors. Excuse me. So, and then we also know that that arrests for survivors of violence, just like for other people, can have other consequences. So, for example, it can impact access to housing, to jobs, and to education. So why does the pipeline exist? And so we just want to talk about this a little bit because although we're talking about systems and the need for systems reform, we know that these systems and what girls are experiencing are operating in a larger, broader context. And so some of the things that we need to keep in mind are about mythologies of girls of color. So, for example, these myths and these tropes that girls of color are hypersexual or fast, myths or misunderstanding about families of color. Oftentimes there's a perception that families of color don't care about their kids when they really do. Lack of getting more information about girls of color, particularly things that we know that they're experiencing. And also, we have on here that currently there's no screening required for sexual abuse or trafficking. There's also currently no data collected on the number of pregnant youth in custody, but there is currently a bill that passed both the House and Senate, the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act reauthorization, that the House and Senate are working to reconcile. And so we are looking forward to that bill becoming law for a number of reasons, but one of them is that it will address those two components. It does create in there a requirement that kids coming into systems be screened for abuse and trafficking, and if they're found to be survivors, to be directed away from the justice system and be connected with services. And there's also a requirement in there to collect data on the number of pregnant youth in custody. Excuse me. And then the last one that I just want to mention is just kind of, again, our overall culture and how even things that we don't think about, like the language that we use, can glamorize exploitation, but then it can also be used to raise awareness. And so for things I think about is, for technology, or not technology, but terminology. Right now, you probably heard teens who say things when they look good that their faces beat, or a lot of euphemisms for. And some of these things that just kind of permeate our culture that we don't really think about can also reinforce these messages. So we just wanted to talk about, before we wrap up, ways that we can dismantle the pipeline. So one of them is definitely identification. Again, reframing our approach to asking questions, asking girls what's going on. And when we see behavior that our society would often deem as delinquent or a misbehavior, really looking behind that behavior and asking questions. Let's see, creating and implementing prevention and intervention programming in schools is definitely important. And I just wanted to point out, that this is not just focused on girls, but also including programs and interventions for boys and their treatment of girls. For example, California now has a law regarding sex trafficking, that sex trafficking prevention must be taught in schools. And so that curriculum includes not just hopefully identifying children who are being trafficked, but also trying to help educate kids about trafficking, so hopefully they themselves will not be trafficked, but also about educating young boys, so hopefully that they will not become buyers or traffickers. Again, developing alternatives to detention criminalization and making sure that those alternatives are really gender responsive and trauma-informed and tailored to meet the specific needs of girls. Multidisciplinary response is key. As we've been discussing, these girls who are at risk of being pushed into the system or who are currently involved in the system are often touched by multiple different systems or have experienced multiple forms of trauma. And so it's just really important that we not be siloed in our responses to them. And then also changing the conversation with our children and our communities. One of the things that we've done here at Rights for Girls is we started a campaign called No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute. And the purpose of this campaign is really to eliminate the notion of the term child prostitute, both in language as well as the law. And so we partnered with a survivor on that, launched a campaign, an online campaign, and got the Associated Press to agree to change their style guidelines on how they report on survivors of child sex trafficking, as well as have partnered with communities like California and advocates who are working in different jurisdictions to be able to change the culture around responses to trafficking survivors, as well as change the law so that they are being treated as survivors of a crime and not being criminalized. So we just wanted to wrap up and just say, as we think it's great that there are so many conversations taking place across the country now about racial justice, mass incarceration, and the need to reform our criminal justice and juvenile justice systems. But unfortunately, these conversations tend to really focus on men and boys. And so the reality of the Abuse to Prison pipeline is that girls of color are being impacted by these systems too, and on an increasing basis. And so we just need to make sure that these efforts that are taking place contemplate them and are also geared towards meeting their needs as well. So this is just a list of some resources, some sites that we wanted to share or you thought there might have some helpful information. I just wanted to point out that on our website, I believe there's a link shared to access the report on sexual abuse to prison pipeline. But we have other fact sheets that talk about the violence that girls of color experience, providing different solutions to some of the things that they face, as well as talking about how some of these systems, like child welfare and juvenile justice, overlap and impact girls of color, particularly survivors of violence. And then we wanted to share contact information. It looks like we have some time to take some questions. I know that that people have been typing them in, so we're happy to answer them now, but also in case we can't get to them all because of time, or in case anyone thinks of some questions later, or if we can be a resource in any way, then here is my and Rebecca's contact information, and you can also please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you, Cherice. Actually, we have 5 or 6 questions. I'm going to read them to you. And the first one is coming from Victoria, and she's asking, I was wondering if sexual abuse can alter metabolism. I was assaulted at a young age and started eating more as comfort. I also have a friend who has 4 other sisters who are all sins, but growing up she was the only one sexually abused, and she believes her metabolism may have been affected.
Thank you so much for your question. So this is actually a relatively new area of study where physicians and researchers are really trying to delve into the impact of trauma on DNA and as well as health outcomes. So I mean, there's definitely a lot of research showing that many individuals use food as a coping mechanism for trauma. So we are noticing that individuals who are struggling with obesity, often there's a history of abuse and trauma. In terms of actually changing the genetic makeup, affecting the metabolism, it's highly likely, based on the studies that we've seen, that the experiences of childhood sexual abuse, it is likely that that could have caused a change in metabolism. It could have made the person more likely to develop chronic illnesses such as hypothyroidism, but that's something that researchers are still trying to figure out. And unfortunately, we're not doctors at Rights for Girls, so we don't want to give any misinformation. But I would say definitely check in with your physicians, and as research is growing after this initial study by Dr. Burke-Harris, I would say that there's probably some link.
Wonderful. Angela's asking if there is any information on how many of these girls disclosed or reported the sexual abuse prior to being charged and or arrested.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything that's collected that data, no.
Annika's asking, how can we assist Cyntoia on a local level?
That's a great question. I think definitely continuing to raise awareness about her experience and her current incarceration. Unfortunately, I know that last year there was a petition that was being sent to the governor as well as her attorneys. Have filed for clemency, and it was just recently shared that request has been denied. So I'm not sure what steps her lawyers are currently taking. When someone's represented by counsel, we really try to follow the lead of their attorney so we can make sure that we are not doing anything that would be contrary to the case or would interfere with the case. And so since that denial of clemency is very recent, I believe it happened just last week, I'm not quite sure what steps her attorneys are taking and what they're asking advocates to take. But we are definitely trying to find out more information on that. So if you want to shoot us a follow-up email, then we're happy to keep you looped in. But right now, I'm not sure. I think it's recouping after this denial of clemency to decide next steps and next approaches. But in the meantime, I think continuing to raise awareness about Cyntoia so people continue to remember her and want to assist her and gain understanding of child sex trafficking is important and helpful.
Another question from Shagusta. How are immigrant children impacted?
So immigrant children are definitely impacted by trafficking because, excuse me, and part of that is because they, they also have vulnerabilities, right? So I think one of the things that really makes it difficult for immigrant children who are being trafficked is traffickers will go after not only vulnerable children, but children that they think are unlikely to disclose or to report. And so definitely with some of the experiences that immigrant children are having with law enforcement, we've heard from different partners that there's definitely been a drop in reporting of sexual assaults. I think in California, a group just did a study, and I think the number drops drastically. So I think that's one way where children are impacted. I think it probably, from what we're finding from our partners in different jurisdictions, is that it can increase their being target for assaults, at least for trafficking, where perpetrators are specifically trying to find people that they think they're less likely to disclose, and it is actually leading to less disclosure because of fears on top of all the fears that survivors have of not being believed and the shame that can come and the trauma, there's also these additional concerns that come with being an immigrant that we're finding makes them also less likely to disclose in this recent climate.
Great. Our next question comes from Loida. Can the CPS DCF defects help this girl?
So can I'm not quite sure. So I think CPS, Child Protective Services, DCF defects isn't a term that that we're familiar with. But in terms of how Child Protective Services can help, I think there's several ways. One is, I'll say that there's has been legislation to require that any child welfare state or local or any child welfare system organization that receives Title IV funding have to report when children go missing from their custody, and so that has increased the response, as well as there's also been legislation that has led states to change their definition of abuse and neglect to allow them to respond to any trafficked child, because before, unless a child, in most jurisdictions, unless a child was being trafficked by a parent or a guardian, then most child welfare systems were not able to respond. So now, because of this law, we're seeing that jurisdictions are changing their definition of abuse and neglect so that there isn't that restriction. So that's increasing the response. And definitely, as you said earlier, asking those questions of, if we see, if they're seeing behavior from a child, finding out what's going on, training to the family, so like therapeutic foster care, so trying to make sure that children who experience trauma and violence are placed with families that understand how that can impact them, and that they've been equipped to be able to help that child, as opposed to maybe feeling like they don't know what to do, so they're going to call the police. Those are some of the main things we've been seeing, and we've also seen child welfare systems in different jurisdictions really partnering with these other systems, excuse me, so that they can better adjust the needs of these girls, and hopefully they not be pushed into the system, or if they are in the system, trying to figure out if there's other ways other than detention to help them. And we found that that's been helpful, because that really increases the sharing of information and understanding for girls' situations. And for example, not just thinking of them as a delinquent child, but understanding like, this girl had this family situation and she's experienced this problematic situation, and just really giving more context.
Our last question is coming from Scotty, and it's, are there any training programs aimed at police or social workers that work to help them recognize trauma, ACS, sexual abuse?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear all that. Could you repeat that one, please?
Are there any training programs aimed at police or social workers that work to help them recognize trauma, adverse childhood experiences, or sexual abuse?
So the answer is yes. I think it just really depends on what area you're in, like what city, in terms of who's doing that training and what it looks like. So I think that's another one that maybe we could better answer offline. So if whoever had that question wants to email myself or Rebecca and let us know kind of what jurisdiction you're in or what locality, and we can try to connect you with some people who are doing trainings and to either police or social workers or whatever particular segment that you're looking for, and try to get you connected.
Wonderful. Well, we ran out of time again. If you have any other questions for Cherice or Rebecca, you see their contact information, and you are going to be receiving a follow-up email, and it will contain the link to the webinar recording, to the PowerPoint slides, and also the link to a brief survey. Be on the lookout for that. I want to thank our our presenters today, Cherice and Rebecca. You have done a wonderful job. Thank you so much for joining us. And everybody else for participating in today's session. I also want to thank our closed captioner, Jane, has done a wonderful job. And I want to recognize Justine Robilar. She's NRCDB staff for her technical support. Brecken Ederman, she has done an amazing job managing the chat box. And Patty Branco, she has been live tweeting throughout all this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you continue support to NRCDB's events and webinars. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.